Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely pumped you're here. Today we're going to tackle one of the most sweeping, dramatic, and just massively impactful historical narratives of all time. We are mapping out the spectacular rise, the staggering peak, and the ultimate tumultuous fall of the Ottoman Empire. And, as always, we're breaking down all this complex history into clear takeaways to help you really lock in the information. So get focused, get comfortable, and let's jump right in.
Right off the bat, let's talk about the sheer scale of what we're dealing with here, because it's pretty staggering. 600 years. Just let that sink in for a second. This was an empire that lasted for over 6 centuries, finally dissolving in 1923. At the absolute pinnacle of its power, this massive state dominated lands stretching all across the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. Honestly, to understand how a modern nation like Turkey even exists today, we have to unpack these 6 centuries of incredible territorial expansion, wild prosperity, and eventual decline.
All right, Section 1, Origins and Early Rise, from the Steppes to Anatolia.
So where did this all begin? Well, to understand their rise, we have to rewind to the migration of Turkic peoples moving westward out of Asia. Back in the 7th century, they moved away from the Altai Mountains, gradually crossing the Eurasian steppe and eventually settling into a semi-nomadic lifestyle around the Caspian and Aral Seas. And it's from these groups that a new warlord emerges in northwestern Turkey. His name? Osman. He becomes the founder of the dynasty that literally bears his namesake, the Ottomans. Now talk about relentless momentum, right? It all really traces back to a crucial moment in 1071, when the earlier Seljuks totally crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert. That single victory effectively handed them control of the Near East and let them push deeper into what is now Turkey. It totally set the stage for the Ottomans to grab territory later on. By 1331, the city of Nicaea fell to the Turks. Then, not long after in 1369, they captured Adrianople, which was just 200 kilometers from Constantinople, and briefly made it their capital. The Ottoman war machine was officially revving up.
Moving on to Section 2, Conquest of Constantinople, the ultimate prize.
Okay, picture this. It's the early 15th century, and the Ottomans have their sights set on the ultimate prize, the heavily fortified Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Now, by this time, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was basically just a shell of its former self, reduced to a tiny bit of territory in Turkey, mainland Greece, and the southern Balkans, all ruled from Constantinople. But this wasn't just any city. This was the most formidable walled city in the medieval world, a fortress that had withstood countless sieges for centuries. But the Ottomans? They were determined. In 1453, Mehmed II lays an epic siege to the city. We're talking 7 grueling weeks in April and May before those supposedly unbreachable walls were finally, incredibly, breached. Fittingly, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, who shared his name with the city's original founder 1,000 years earlier, fell in the fighting. Later that exact same day, the city completely fell. Constantinople became the new Ottoman capital, and the stunning Hagia Sophia Cathedral was immediately reconsecrated as a mosque.
Section 3, Peak of Ottoman Power, a global superpower. So after bagging Constantinople, this empire goes on an absolute tear. We enter an era of massive, multi-continental global expansion that turns the Ottomans into a true global superpower. The crucial point here is that a succession of highly active warrior sultans were personally out there leading these conquests. Mehmed II quickly overruns Greece, Bosnia, and sets up a presence in the Crimea. Then Bayezid II takes Syria and the Levant, totally defeating the Egyptian Mamluks. Selim I comes in, and even though he only ruled for 8 years, he conquers virtually all of North Africa, including Egypt and Libya. And then we get Suleiman the Magnificent. Ruling for nearly half a century, he expands their borders all the way from Hungary down to Egypt and Oman. He even takes his armies right up to the gates of Vienna in 1529.
Now, you're probably wondering, how on earth did they pull all this off? Well, their military proficiency was just unmatched during its heyday. They had this beautifully cohesive balance of well-trained infantry, cavalry, and artillery. But their fighting force was heavily reliant on an elite group of soldiers known as the Janissaries, and their backstory is intense. These were actually captured as child slaves from Christian lands in southwestern Europe. They were forced to convert to Islam and then drafted into the Ottoman army under the absolute strictest codes of discipline and professionalism you can imagine. It made them an unbelievably effective, terrifyingly efficient fighting force.
Which brings us to Section 4, Stagnation and Imperial Decline. The tides turn. Because as we know, no empire expands forever. By the late 17th century, after basically spending 2 solid centuries waging war against Christendom in Western and Central Europe, the Ottomans start facing massive Christian alliances pushing back, hard. The ultimate turning point comes in 1683. The Ottomans try to take Vienna again, this time with a massive force of over 150,000 men led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. But they get totally undone when a Christian Holy League relief force shows up, led by Polish King John III Sobieski. He unleashes 18,000 horsemen right into the Turkish encampment. Guys, this remains the largest cavalry charge in human history. The Ottomans were devastatingly routed, and that stunning defeat, it forever halted Ottoman expansion into Europe. They would literally gain no further ground on the continent after that.
So as we push into the 18th century, a relative decline really sets in, mostly due to political stagnation. See, while the 15th and 16th centuries had those active warrior sultans taking a direct, hands-on role, by the 17th and 18th centuries, the sultans kind of took a back seat. They retreated to pass their time in harems and gardens, leaving the day-to-day, decentralized rule to grand viziers and local administrators. But I want to pause here and highlight a really crucial point. Despite this political stagnation, the empire remained incredibly tolerant. Christians and other religions were accepted. In fact, it was actually a primary haven for Europe's Jewish population, fleeing brutal persecution in places like Spain. To put that in perspective, by 1519, the city of Thessaloniki was 54% Jewish.
But here's the thing. Tolerance doesn't necessarily save an economy. For centuries, the Ottomans controlled the incredibly wealthy overland Silk Road trade flowing from India and China right through their Mediterranean cities. But then, the entire center of world economic activity just shifted. Large ocean-going vessels started carrying trade out of the Americas and the Far East all the way across the Atlantic. This European-controlled maritime trade effectively bypassed the Ottomans entirely. It massively reduced Europe's reliance on those overland routes, made Ottoman networks obsolete, and drastically accelerated the technology and scientific gap between the Ottomans and their European rivals.
Section 5. The Sick Man of Europe, a Fracturing State.
All right, welcome to the 19th century. With economic stagnation and rapid technological advancements happening everywhere else, the Ottoman position wasn't seen as a threat anymore. It was seen as a weakness to be exploited. In fact, they earned this famous, kind of brutal title on the global stage, the Sick Man of Europe. And we watch as the empire is systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Local uprisings spring up, aggressively backed by opportunistic European powers who were super eager to see Ottoman presence decline so they could swoop in. In 1804, a Serbian uprising called Balkan control into question, with Russia later pushing in. In 1821, the Greek War of Independence broke out, heavily supported economically and militarily by Britain, France, and Russia. And by 1830, France straight up invaded Algeria to set up its own colony. The sick man was just being picked apart.
Obviously, this never-ending period of decline deeply alarmed the younger generation, which led to the emergence of Turkish nationalists. At the forefront was a group known as the Young Turks. They wanted to strip away the centuries-old sultanate entirely and replace it with a modern constitutional monarchy and a Western-style parliament. And they actually pulled off a revolution in 1908 that ushered in a constitutional government. But, well, the Young Turks were a pretty messy alliance of liberals, academics, and conservative military elements. They just couldn't rule by consensus. Ultimately, their tumultuous internal politics only further exacerbated the empire's collapse, right at the exact moment they needed unity the most.
Finally, Section 6, Collapse and Modern Turkey, the final chapter.
The absolute end of the Ottoman Empire would ultimately come from both within and without, completely inextricably linked to the catastrophic outbreak of the First World War. Now, up until 1914, the Turks had managed to avoid the major European military alliances. But in the summer of 1914, seeing a chance to push back against Russian advancements, they joined Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy as part of the Central Powers. And they had extremely mixed fortunes. On one hand, they actually scored a massive victory against the Allies during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. But on the other hand, between 1916 and 1918, they lost vast tracts of territory in the Middle East to the Arab Revolt, which was famously instigated by the British adventurer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. We also have to look at the facts regarding a very dark chapter during this war. Based on the historical record detailed in our sources, from 1915 onwards, the government engaged in acts of genocide against its Armenian subjects. This brutal internal campaign resulted in the tragic deaths of an estimated 1.5 million people.
Overall, the First World War was just a total disaster for the Ottomans. They simply couldn't maintain the war effort. By 1918, the Turkish military was in total collapse, and victorious allied nations actually occupied much of Turkey. As you can imagine, this sparked a massive revolt. In May 1919, the Turkish War of Independence begins. A former Ottoman general named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk successfully led the Turkish nationalists in a really fierce campaign. By October 1922, they had pushed Greek and Allied forces right out of mainland Turkey. The following year, in 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne officially established the modern Republic of Turkey, transferring the capital from Constantinople over to Ankara. Just like that, the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire formally ceased to exist.
And there we have it. We've traced the incredible arc of a minor regional power that grew to dominate entire continents, only to be fractured and eventually rebuilt into a modern republic. When you look at a map of the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe today, how does the legacy of this massive 600-year empire continue to shape the borders, the cultures, and the politics of our modern world? It's definitely something to think about because the echoes of the Ottoman Empire are absolutely still writing the history of today. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey, and keep learning.